The Sustainable Voice, bringing you big successes from small places worldwide.
So we just walked through the community, the town of Kisoro. It's voting day, as I mentioned to you. Why did we do this? Why did Hillary and I go and walk through and talk to somebody in line, have Hillary share his thoughts?
Hey guys, Ashish Sanghrajka, host of Sustainable Voice, back at you again. And as you can tell, I am out of the studio. I'm on the road. I'm actually on my way to Asia. I've actually been on the road quite a bit the first part of this year, but I want to talk about something on my travels that happened that was quite unique. But before I do, first of all, hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, hit that bell notification if you like the topics. Feel free to send us some messages, send us some ideas. If there's a topic you want to hear about, we would be happy to cover it for you. We have so many new guests that are coming up this year. They're going to be able to talk about some unique elements. It is election season all over the world, not just in our part of the world, but all over the world. As of this recording, the parliamentary elections, the first round of elections for the presidential position is starting in Colombia. Pretty soon they'll be starting in Peru. But I want to talk about what happened in Uganda, because I was actually there in January when presidential elections happened there. And yes, I was there for the week or roughly thereat where the internet was turned off. We were given 3 hours notice and then the internet was turned off. So we couldn't record this live while we were there. I was hoping to. I did, however, have a chance to go out into the cities and the rural cities and actually talk to people in line. So I want to talk about what it's like to experience an election in Uganda. Now, those of you know I'm from Kenya, so I'm used to this. My mom's from Sudan, again, used to this. We're used to elections being sometimes on the up and up and sometimes not so much. So either way, we're used to it. But I want to talk specifically about the fact that we did have these conversations with locals and what these actually mean, because there's something that's not being covered, not being talked about. And also how the elections are in these emerging nations, the democracies operate differently than what we experience here. Just what's not being talked about, right? What I want to take you guys inside and show you what this experience is about. I had the great honor of speaking to people while they were in line to vote. I got the permission of the local authorities to speak to them respectfully and wanted to get them on camera. We actually have a bunch of B-roll that actually shows some of those conversations that are there. Now, I want to basically come in to talk about not just the process, but how it's perceived here. I wrote a piece on LinkedIn some time back that talked about the fact that a lot of the developed nations will look down on developing nations and look down on their politics, look down on their election process. And I wrote a piece that simply asked one question to all the developed nations and all the leaders of these developed nations. Have you looked in the mirror lately? Have you actually seen what your election process looks like? And ours are included. It's not perfect here either. That's not supposed to be. It's a work in progress. So we're gonna jump into this part of it. The political process may look different, but that doesn't mean that they're less meaningful to citizens. And that's the part we want to talk about, is that it is still meaningful. Could it be that there is some irregularities? Absolutely. I learned about some of the articles after we left Uganda when we got to Kenya and other places, and I got messages all of a sudden. Are you okay? We heard about Uganda. Are you okay? Are you all right? Everything was fine. But the perception and what's being there, and sometimes we get caught up in thinking that these elections are a sham. Why bother? They're not, because we don't quite understand what's meaningful to local citizens. So we're going to talk about that today. We're also going to talk about the outdated nature of the term developing world, right? And I just used it on purpose to talk about developed nations versus developing nations. There's a global economic shift underway. There is a massive, massive shift. When you take a look at Indonesia and where they are as a top 10 economy worldwide, of course, India emerging, you are talking about some of the largest elements of foreign investment entering the African continent more than any other part of the world. So when some of the richest nations in the world have a choice of where to invest their money, they're not investing it in the Western Hemisphere. They're not investing it in the Eastern Hemisphere. They're investing it in Africa. They're investing it in countries in Latin America. That's the element of it. So there's a shift that's occurring. Look no further again to see some of the emerging economies, where Vietnam is, where India is, where Indonesia is. And we're also going to talk about economic growth versus political perception. We sometimes will take a look at political instability or political process, and look, it doesn't look different than ours, well, they have to be a struggling economy because they can't even get their elections right. Not always the case. We're also going to talk about the fact that Western countries still view these nations through an outdated lens. And there's a role that the media serves in terms of the narratives and the role of those narratives and how it actually is a disservice. And what I mean by that is a disservice because it's painting a picture for you rather than allowing you to see for yourself. So let's start with this. I have a question for all of you. First of all, before I ask the question, I want to make sure I say thank you to all of our new subscribers, all of our new listeners who've been growing leaps and bounds, just to make sure I say thank you to all of you. But I do, back to this, a question to you. Who actually gets to define what a developing nation is, right? Who gets to define what a developing nation? Let's start there. Who gets to define that? And while we're talking about that, let's talk about the political atmosphere and what it felt like on the ground. So we were in Entebbe, and then we had actually gone out to the Kazinga Channel in Queen Elizabeth National Park. And while we were there, I got wind of the internet shutting off, and then we got the official notice. It was 3 hours notice, and then sure enough, it was turned off completely. So there was an internet blackout all across the entire country. So anything that was happening in the news, anything that was happening, that locally, we weren't seeing it. That includes emails, that includes everything. Text messages worked a little bit, but the atmosphere was this. There were, of course, posters everywhere for the reelection of the current president who was reelected. He's been there for 40 plus years. And so there's, of course, there. And there was a slogan underneath there that was basically protecting the gains. And that was his slogan was Uganda has made so much progress, protecting the gains. Now, I thought that was peculiar because that's what I would say as well, right? Forget about the candidate, but I would say that as well because Uganda's history is pretty well known of where it came from during the time of Idi Amin and even before, where Uganda was while it was a colony, before it was a colony, where it was during Idi Amin's time, where it is today. And even after the reign of Idi Amin, it still didn't really emerge. But those gains have occurred. Uganda has some of the largest amounts of foreign investment coming from India, coming from parts of Asia, coming from even the US. Everything from cell phone carriers and towers in areas like Jinja and Kampala to wind turbines coming up in other areas of the country, to alternative energy sources, through hydropower, tourism. There's such a huge shift that has occurred over the last few decades. There was a level of excitement that existed about this. Now, around election time, here's the one thing I noticed right off the bat. There is a sense of pride. Ugandans know that their election process is flawed. They know that it's not perfect. But they're running off of a constitution that was written in 1995, not 1795. And it was the second or third iteration. And that's important to remember, right? We are not electing our 40th president or 50th president. Some of these countries in Africa, you're on your second, your third, your fifth, your 10th, fourth president. So this is still a very young process. Before this, many countries were part of a commonwealth. They were part of a colony with the British, a colony with the French, among others. And some of these countries in Africa have changed names. They've gone through iterations. When my mother was living in Sudan, when her family was there, South Sudan didn't exist. Here we are. Zaire existed. Now it doesn't. Here we are. You start seeing what was Rhodesia. You start seeing what was Zaire. You start seeing some of these countries and what they have shifted to. So you are talking about a continent that has gone through a massive, massive shift, not just politically, but economically, even from a perspective point of view. And even their presence at the world stage is very important. So the locals do take this very seriously. And what I mean by that is they take pride. There were lines around the street. I mean, I went to some of the more remote villages and went to talk to people here, but there were lines. You would talk to people about the elections. And typically when you go to, we talk about elections, for example, here in our country or anywhere else. And of course, everybody has one side or the other. People will have a comment one way or the other. What I noticed here is people weren't talking about their electoral process. They were talking about what it meant for them to vote. They were talking about why voting was so important to them. And then they were going into the details of what happens, why we have a runoff, what are the parliamentary elections, what the municipalities look like, why this is important, why the right to vote was such a protected and sacred moment for them. the ability to go and line up and actually put their ballot in. Of course, after they voted, and I went to some of these communities after they voted, and they were celebrating. Think about this for a second. If you go to vote in the US, in Europe, in parts of Asia, Australia in particular, it's mandatory to vote. You get fined if you don't go vote. It's a duty. You go and you vote, then you go home. You get a little sticker, and then you go about your day, or you go to work, or you go about your day. They voted, and then they came together. They celebrated. They were standing around. Yes, they drank as well. Nothing bad was happening where we were, but they weren't really talking about the election or the candidates. They were celebrating the fact that they had the right to vote. Now, in places like Kampala, just like in cities around the world, of course, there was definitely disruption. There was definitely some bad actors. There was definitely some activity. Now, again, this is not the only country. If you take a look at other parts of the world, Europe, US, parts of South America, this is normal. There is going to be discord in different ways. That's a big part of it. But they were still convening, and they were celebrating that they were there. There were police everywhere. So while they were waiting in line, there was security everywhere. There were observers everywhere. And what amazed me was the civic participation. Here's why it amazed me. In our country, you can go vote. I mean, if you're in the city, you can go vote, show the precinct. And yes, you've got your precinct, but you can move it around. Uganda, you have to go back to where your village is. You have to go back to where you came from. So sometimes that's a 5-hour drive, a 7-hour drive. Sometimes it's a flight. If you're working elsewhere, if you have to go back. People made it back. They were making it a point to make it back. Now, some that were working couldn't get to vote. However, the majority made it back, and they were. Think about that. How much pride it is. Would you take a 6-hour bus ride? Not a private car, but a bus. Would you take a 6-hour bus ride in a non-air conditioned vehicle? Not that it was overly hot, but in a non-air conditioned vehicle on graded dirt roads, some paved roads, some bumpy roads, with 50 of your best friends you've never met? Would you take that drive just to go vote? Just to go stand in line, just to go vote? I didn't think so. Ugandans actually did. And that's the part that I thought was really, really special, was the fact that they were there. And when I talked to people online, they were explaining to me that one person was talking about how they have actually walked for almost 6 hours to get there. Another one took a bus for a few hours. Another one traveled for 2 days to get back to where they had to vote, because you cannot just vote wherever you are. You have to go back to where your precinct is, where you were assigned to vote. And you're assigned that precinct basically for majority of your life, right? Unless you there's a process to move that. But otherwise, you're there, you're with your family, you go back to where your roots are, and you're voting from there. It was a beautiful process. It was one that I really, really enjoyed. So there are police officers everywhere. In fact, at one point, I was talking to one of the people online, and the police officer comes up and says, "Are you supposed to be here? Please move the camera this way." And it wasn't that he was censoring me. He was basically telling me, and he explained to me, he said, you're free to talk to everybody here, but we don't want the camera aimed at the lines, only because of the fact that there are people in that line who don't want to be on camera. Privacy laws exist there too. I respected that. So we did pull a few people aside and started talking to them. And what they said to me was that, of course, the civic participation, that they never felt unsecure. There was nobody there trying to sway their votes to go one way or the other. There was nobody that was there trying to keep them from voting. There was no sort of militia there that was trying to prevent the road from going or blocking the road. Sure, it made the news afterwards in bigger cities like Kampala and whatnot. But again, if you look at the most powerful, rich nations in the world, they have some of the same problems. So it's not isolated to a place like Uganda. What intrigued me, which I thought was really great, was the provincial elections. The people that were voting, yes, they cast their ballot for president, but they knew who the winner was going to be. And what they said was, look, we know who the winner is going to be for the presidential election. We're not as concerned about that. We are concerned, and we are focusing more on the municipal elections, on the people who represent our district, our municipality. And that was really important. The local ministers was really important to them, because those people are from their community. They get to hold them accountable through their own way. They get to make sure that they come back. And what they explained to me was that if you are from this community and you're elected as a minister, yes, okay, there's all sorts of influence that occurs once you go into a federal office. However, you still have to come back to your people and answer for your actions, answer for your representation, your leadership. It's different when you go into a city and you hold a town hall and you talk to your town hall about how you represented them and what you've done for them. It's different versus going back to a small village and actually speaking to people who are either farmers or drivers or working in tourism or who knows, whatever the case may be, and explaining to them some of the decisions that you've made and why you've made them. So there's a level of accountability in these countries that honestly is admirable on the municipal level, very admirable. And something that I think a lot of other countries can learn from. And I noticed that right away in looking at these elections in Uganda. It is still very much the old-fashioned paper into a box, and then the boxes are taken and counted. So it takes a few days to count, but people are then glued to their TVs the next day, and they're listening to their ministers, or listening to watching the polls. They're listening to who's there. But that's that's what they care about the most is the local municipalities, the ministers that are being elected there. So even if a particular election is foregone, it's a high turnout just because of the fact that they care about their own particular area, and that's what they're voting. So that's really key. The campaigning was something else as well. No, we talk about campaign finance reform in the US and other countries as well, and we talk about the need for campaign finance reform, super PACs and everything else. Those don't really exist. You've got big stickers, you've got guys on bullhorns that are walking through town, you've got rallies that are held in the middle of a town and people giving speeches and whatnot. It's the way it used to be. It's not choreographed. Well, maybe to a certain degree it is, but it's not curated. What I mean by that is it's raw. It is stump speeches. It is going up and talking to constituents, people, yelling with joy, screaming, and if they're not happy, they're yelling out and letting they don't agree. But it's organic. It's natural, which I thought was really, really great. I remember, growing up in Kenya, we had a president that was in power for over 2 decades. Again, we knew that there was going to be discord in Kenya. We knew that there was going to be disruption. You take a look at Sudan right now, the country's in a civil war as of this recording, where the previous general, this is not South Sudan, in Sudan itself, near Wat Madni and Khartoum, the previous general is trying to come back into power after he was ousted. And he's trying to reclaim leadership from the person who ousted him. Not by election, obviously. It was almost like a pseudo coup, but now the country's in full civil war. When you look at a place like Uganda, Uganda's been through those painful moments. They've been through some of the darkest parts of history, right? And I'm not just talking about Idi Amin, I'm talking about the full history. And to have these people then who have lived through that, right? These are not young people. They're young people are voting too, but they're elders that have been through this, that have actually seen this. I thought that was really beautiful. We're going to talk about Colombia's election process in another episode because there's some interesting facts about age gaps there that are important to know. But those age gaps exist in Uganda. There is a period or a section of population from 31 to 52 that's underrepresented, and that's because of some of the history. And then there's the younger generation and the older generation, and there's definitely an age gap. There's a generational gap that occurs here. But it's almost as if voting brought all generations together. I saw 20-year-olds and 60-year-olds waiting in line. And, they weren't trying to sway one or the other. Maybe behind closed doors they were. Maybe while they were having a beer, on one of the days they would maybe. But otherwise, they were. It was there. They were constantly involved. The other part that's really important is that, again, these democracies operate differently. Yeah, of course, they have a president, they've got a cabinet, they've got the parliament. But the parliamentary elections or midterms, we call them midterms in America, they don't really have midterms there. They've got regular elections. And yes, they've got provincial elections that occur out of sequence as well. But those provincial elections are what they care about the most, right? They care about those a lot. Imagine in the US, midterm elections, as important as they are, imagine them being more important than the presidential election. Imagine them being the most consequential part of the election circuit or cycle that occurs in the US. That's what happens in countries like Uganda. And it's beautiful to see. We talk about term limits in the US, we talk about term limits in other areas. It's beautiful to see that, yes, term limits are an issue. In Uganda, of course, you've got, like the president's in power for 4 decades. But the sequence in which they talk, where they're not talking about staying in power because of X, Y, and Z. It's, again, maintaining the gains or protecting the gains. They're trying to make sure they don't go back to where they came from. Again, I'm not saying it's perfect. I do understand. I'm from Africa, so I do understand that there is more than the eye. I do understand that there is definitely people who are upset about some of the results. But I want to just make sure that all of you understand that the people I spoke to in line, and this is in towns like Kisoro, areas like the Kasinga Channel, areas even in Tebe, even in these areas, what I understood and what I was listening intently was the fact that it was the process. The fact that they had the right to stand in line to vote was really important. It actually took me back to 2008 when Kenya, through the disruption that had occurred because of a political instability that had occurred during the election that time, a constitution was born. And it was born in 2008, ratified around 2008, 2009. And that constitution is still being used to govern the elections because nobody generally likes the outcome, but they still use it to try to talk about voter fraud, voter rigging, whatnot. In Uganda, this constitution is from 1995. And yes, there are still conversations about voter rigging and whatnot that happen in some of the cities. Does it exist? Smarter people than me can talk about that. But we have the same conversations here, and we have a whole computerized system in the US. We have a whole computerized system in Europe. Yeah, it still comes up. So it's not isolated, and that's important. The other thing that's really important is talking about the emerging democracies, right? So the fact that the political process is part of their emergence. Again, they know it's not perfect, but it is part of their emergence as an economy. So we shouldn't be looking down our nose at them. We should be understanding that the election process is the actual conduit, the vehicle, the spark, whatever you want to call it, that is actually furthering their economic emergence, right? It is furthering their relevance, not just relevance, but validates their existence in the international community. Their world leaders get taken seriously. Now, this is important because in 2023, I had the pleasure of being in the same room with some of the presidents and vice ministers of some of the most powerful countries in Africa, and being able to talk to their cabinet. I remember one country in particular, I was speaking glowingly about their leader and about what that leader was doing, and why that leader being in power was such a launch or a huge catalyst for that particular country. And members of her cabinet and even his cabinet both came back and said, "You spoke so highly of our leader. We are so proud to be citizens of X country because of how you spoke." It was like you had given them the Medal of Freedom. So the things that we sometimes take for granted in Europe, in the US, Australia, New Zealand, they're sacred in countries like this. And we have to remember that. I think that's really, really key. Now, one of the things that I think is very important is, again, this developing world, developed world, developing nation, developed nation. When I was in college, I had a political science professor who, by the way, predicted the college basketball March Madness champion, not just the winner, but even the score spread within 2 points. So, he's now a professor at a different university, but if anybody wants to know who's going to win March Madness at the time of this recording, who's going to win the tournament, it's probably the guy you should ask. You should look him up. I went to the University of Arizona. He's not there. He's somewhere else now. But he was pretty bang on. However, we had talked about a core periphery system. We talked about the core, the periphery from a trade standpoint, from a supply chain standpoint. So it wasn't even developed. It was core periphery. It wasn't first world, third world. It was core periphery because we were talking strictly from a trade supply chain standpoint. Somehow the conversation shifted to developed, developing, to rich, poor, to first world, third world. And I did go back and have a conversation and asked him about this. And he said, this is the perception that has shifted. This is the perception that, oh, look at them over there. Look at us and look at them. We have our process. Oh, look, they look at their process. They're still learning. It's not true. So this professor, which I adore, he made a very good point. He said, if you keep it with trade, then you will see much clearly the economic paradigm shift that is occurring around the world. Some of the richest countries in the world in the 90s and the 80s are now 40, 50, 20, $10 trillion in debt. Some of the richest countries in the world are now having their debt bought by countries that at one point were developing nations and now are no longer. You now have countries that were one time seen as developing nations that are now loaning out as much money as the World Bank to some of the other countries. You see economic diversification from these countries that at one point were called third world nations or developing nations. We have to get rid of this term developed and developing. And I'm guilty of it too. Don't get me wrong. I'm guilty of it too. But I think it starts back, and I'll bring it back to my long beef with the IMF and the World Bank and how they operate. But it is very much this case where I think you have to understand this because it is, again, it's a very beautiful, beautiful process. But we have to, as I agree, as my professor told me, keep it in trade terms. Keep it as core periphery or whatever language you want to use, but keep it in trade terms in terms of the supply chain. Keep it in trade terms in terms of the supply chain. And you start seeing and understanding who the real leaders are. For example, Indonesia is emerging as a top economy in the world. They are the leading source of nickel in the world. Nickel is used for everything from batteries to manufacturing and beyond. So you start seeing some of the rare earth minerals, some of the precious minerals that these countries have. And that's how they're being valued by that. We can't look at in the old world that this country's GDP is this much, this country's GDP is this much, that way this country's a rich nation, this country's a poor nation. You could have the highest GDP in the world, but if you're $50 trillion in debt, what does it actually mean? And I'm not talking about the US, I'm talking in general. This is just general terms. We have to get rid of that term. We have to basically look at specifically the core of the supply chain management. And then we also have to talk about the fact that, and we have to acknowledge that this global economic shift is occurring. And you want proof, take a look at where these nations that were once called the richest nation in the world, where is their money going? It is not going to each other. It is not going to Japan. It's not going to UK. It's not going to Spain, to France. It's not going to the US. It's going to Kenya. It's going to Egypt. It's going to Tanzania. It's going to Uganda. It's going to Rwanda. It's going to South Africa. It's going to Argentina. It's going to Peru. It's going to Ecuador. You start seeing my point that it is starting to there's a shift occurring, and that's very important. If we understand the supply chain and the links within that supply chain of who serves what purpose, you start seeing changes in that supply chain. You start seeing modernizations, you start seeing innovation. For example, the AI boom. You start seeing the AI, the paradigm shifts. AI is changing everything, right? Everything from manufacturing process to jobs, to what kind of jobs we're going to have. And what you're seeing now is some of these countries that were called the developing nations now have the brightest minds for AI in those countries. Whereas the countries that were deemed the wealthy nations or developed nations, they're the ones struggling to actually find the intellectual education or intellectual property within their citizens to be able to handle where this is going. Yes, of course, you still have the advanced technology in some of the richest nations in the world. I'm not saying that, but you do have some of the brightest minds now showing up in some of the other countries. Supply chain is very important, and I would say that defining a world order according to supply chain and the link with that supply chain is a much more accurate gauge of how you see the world, is who has money and who doesn't, whose GDP is at 1.2%, whose GDP is at 5%, what's the size of their economy. I would not look at it that way because that's going to change very, very quickly. Take India as an example. India was out of the top 10 as recent as 25 years ago, maybe just entering the top 10. They're number 4 right now, about to enter top 3 by the end of the decade. And they might be number 1 by the time we hit to 2050, not China or whatever the case may be. This is where that question that came back to you, that I asked you earlier, I want to come back to. Who actually gets to define what a developing nation is? Do we get to define it? Who gets to define it? You'll understand a country a lot more if you follow their position in the supply chain, because then you'll be able to see just how important they are. I'll tell you a story around this. When you start looking at electric cars, lithium is required for those batteries for electric cars. And where does that lithium come from? Well, one of the highest sources of lithium is Chile, not the US, not UK, not other parts of Europe, not Australia, although it is there. Chile. So when you're looking at iron, precious metals, Uganda has that in droves. Uganda has all that. So it's not whether you are the rich nation. It's whether your link in the supply chain is so powerful or so vital that everything else gets paralyzed if your chain doesn't work. That's how you measure a country. That's how you measure global status in the country. And that's not me saying it. That's some of the brightest minds, people that taught me. They're saying it. I had two economic professors, excuse me, that have gone on to become economic advisors for past presidents. They've gone on to work in international councils. They are clearly some of the brightest minds. And they said this too. And I agree fully with it. So, when we talk about defining who a developing versus developed nation is, I would say the person or the organization or the country, excuse me, that has the most vital cog in that supply chain, they get to say it. And it's not always us. And usually it isn't the richest nation. The nation that is getting the finished product to put out to the consumer, that's not the most vital cog. That's just the outlet. The nation that actually has to create it, that's the one. You want proof? Take a look at the pandemic. When the pandemic first started, and it started before that as well, but what got amplified was the shortage in microchips, the shortage in chips. And you had cars being sold missing certain chips. Those chips, where'd they come from? They were coming from the richest nations in the world. We could have just made more. You had companies rearranging their entire manufacturing process to make these chips. Why? Because the chips couldn't come over. They were not made here. The supply chain was broken, and the most vital part of that chain held the entire rest of the chain hostage. This is so important because the quicker we get to understand what supply chain looks like and how much power this holds, the less chance there is of this being weaponized. Every time we don't understand something, if we don't understand currency manipulation, it becomes weaponized. We don't understand biological warfare, it becomes weaponized. We don't understand, just economic movement, it becomes weaponized. I'm not talking about weaponized from terrorists or whatnot. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about weaponized one country or another. I'm talking about trade imbalances, trade wars. I'm talking about everything from economic strife to just general disagreements. But what we don't understand is what gets weaponized. Here, if we understand just how connected we all are through the supply chain, we can make better decisions, more cohesive decisions. I recently gave a talk where I was speaking on this very topic, the fact that during the pandemic, the aggregate contribution that tourism made to a country's economy was not calculated properly. And that's because nobody knew how to do it. That's why you saw such disjointed results. You saw such disjointed decision-making trees. You saw uneven application of those decisions once they were made. You had public scolding for countries that were actually developing or finding out where the new strains were. You had countries were closing borders, others opening borders. You had countries reinstating certain closures, other countries saying, no, we have to open up. And if you look carefully, the countries with the most money weren't necessarily the ones who got this right, whereas the countries with the least amount of money in the bank may have actually been the ones who understood the actual ramifications to their economics better than any other. You want proof of that? All right, well, how about this? As the richest nation in the world, we are the only developed nation in the world that doesn't have a tourism minister. Sure, we have a commerce department, but we don't have a minister of tourism. I know because I was in DC lobbying for it with the travel organization, and still hasn't occurred. We don't have a minister of tourism. Yes, there's talk of one being there under the commerce secretary, but to have one with a direct line of sight to central leadership, to be able to be the face of U.S. tourism as a minister of tourism, doesn't exist. So again, that's part of it as well. So understanding it is very, very key. Let me shift over to what we get wrong, developed nations, what the West, East, whatever the case, what they get wrong. It's oversimplified narratives. We see people waiting in line and see a paper going into a box and go, that's rigged. That's not real. That's not the real election. That's not what it looks like. That's not what's supposed to occur here. There's room for error. It's not computerized. It's not this. It's not. We're not following the way it go. We're oversimplifying just because people wait in line and because they're wearing flip flops instead of shoes, because they're not wearing a suit and tie, because they're wearing maybe sometimes a tattered shirt, that they're somehow are less than, just because their rules are different. So we're oversimplifying their governance, oversimplifying the democracy. We see police officers in line and go, oh my gosh, they're being oppressed. Those police officers are there. They're forcing them to vote. Not true. This is really important just because you need to be able to understand what perception is, and it can't be oversimplified. What you need to understand above all else when it comes to the countries like Uganda is the Constitution. When was the Constitution formed, right? Take a look at Peru. Peru has had 8 presidents in 6 years, about to have their 9th with elections coming up as of this recording. Does that make them less than? If you say yes, then why are we talking about term limits in the West? Why are we talking about term limits? So, and again, I'm not saying right or wrong, but we can't oversimplify it and say, well, this is why. This is why this occurs. This is why this is happening. We can't oversimplify it like that. We need to actually have a broader conversation about this. Okay. So that's going to be something that I urge all of you that, again, if we understand the supply chain, understand the most vital links in a supply chain, of a global supply chain, we will understand that these elections do have ramifications, but you got to understand those elections, not who the presidential elections are, but the provincial, parliamentary elections, the local ministers. Those are the elections that come up as the most meaningful elections, and understanding that those elections, their elections, sometimes are more complex than ours. Just because they're putting papers in a ballot box versus using a computer or a Scantron or any kind of a coded sheet doesn't make it any more or less. Just because they carry the ballot boxes in the back of motorcycles and go down a muddy road to deliver the boxes to be counted, just because they count the boxes by hand, they count the ballots by hand, they don't actually use a computer to do it, doesn't make it less than. So don't oversimplify it. I think we're all guilty of it, myself included. So I think that's really important. The other part is also the local context, what we're talking about so far. So the parliamentary elections, understand what part of the election cycle is more important to the locals. What I discovered in Uganda from the get-go when talking to these people in line was that they were so proud, first of all, to have the right to vote, because many of them were around and alive when they didn't have that right, when they were living under a dictatorship of some form, or a colony where they were part of the British colony or French, where they didn't have the right to vote. They were simply ruled. None of us are old enough to know what that feels like. My late father was, but none of us were old enough to know what it feels like. My mother is. The people I saw in line in Uganda, they are. People you see in line in Peru, in Tanzania, in Kenya, they are. In Colombia, they are. They're old enough to remember what it was like when they didn't have the right to vote, or when their vote just didn't mean anything. So sure, come and tell them that their elections are irregular or imperfect. Absolutely, so are ours. Go and tell them there are ways to improve it, but don't look down on them. That's the one thing they don't like. And they all told me that as well, saying, look, we just want you to respect our process. Yeah, we're not as advanced, but we were around when we didn't get to vote. A lot of the people that are voting in the West weren't around when that right didn't exist. We don't know what that looks like. We need to be able to see that from that prism. And I think that's that lens, that's really important. And then the cultural differences in the government structures, right? Yeah, parliaments, what does it mean? How does it work? What does majority look like? What does minority? Elections in some of these countries get very tribal. They get very community based, right? So you might have 2 or 3 parties. You might have a conservative and liberal party, for example, but the candidates come from different areas. So there's a separate subset of this that actually is more tribal, that is dealing with a specific community or indigenous race or an indigenous part of that citizen body, right? So it's not just Ugandans and non-Ugandans, or Ugandans and expats. It's specifically indigenous communities all over the country, and they represent. So while you might have one party, those local elections that are occurring, for example, in Kazinga, are going to be very different than the elections in Kisoro. And they're not going necessarily by party lines. They're going by who is part of their blood, who is part of their indigenous tree, who is part of their cultural background. Somebody could be living in the same community, but you could be from different backgrounds. So that's a part of this. We don't necessarily have this problem. Well, I shouldn't say we don't. We do. We just don't want to see it. You want proof of this? When's the last? Look at what happens when you talk about a candidate who is gay or Jewish or Hindu or Muslim or Buddhist. First thing you see is, oh, that person can't get elected. We're not ready for that yet. Or a woman. We're not ready for that yet. So we can't judge them. We need to understand the importance of being able to approach this with humility, and to know the cultural differences, and know that we have our own cultural differences. The only real, not even difference, but the real stark relation that I see, and the stark separation that I see, is that they're dealing with it. A lot of other countries are not. They are. It's part of it. So understand that's really, really, really key. So I think it's, I wanted to make sure I talked to you guys about this because it was something on my mind. I wanted to make sure I talked to you guys about the fact that I got to see this firsthand. I mean, what was I going to do? There was no internet. I got to see this firsthand, and I got to see it from a standpoint of people waiting in line and just faces beaming in terms of what they were doing. And I thought that was really, really important. We've talked about these lessons, and I think if I just recap these lessons for Uganda, there's three broad strokes. One is understanding that there is no such thing as developed and developing. There is no such thing as rich and poor. Yeah, it's how much money is in your bank, but if you've got trillions and trillions, and you're the biggest economy in the world, but you're almost $50 trillion in debt, how rich are you really? Versus a country that maybe is a fraction of that, but they're running not as heavy as a deficit as that. It's all relation, I know. So the first thing is understanding that economics are not always economics. You got to drill deeper. The second part of it is supply chain. You'll understand the true vital power of a country in the global economy if you understand their role in the supply chain. So the labels of developed and developing don't make sense. They need to focus in on the supply chain. Where do they fall in the supply chain? Which cog are they, and how important is that cog? That's how you value them. That's how we respect them. That's how we embrace them. That's how the global community gets closer, by understanding who plays what role, so we're rowing in the same direction. And the third thing is understanding that these elections there's indigenous communities involved. It's not political parties, it's indigenous parties, it's indigenous communities. It is a heritage that's being spoken about. It is a way of life that's being spoken about, a cultural way of life that's being spoken about, not specifically about what a race is, whether it's conservative or liberal. Yeah, that comes into it, but that's not the main draw. It is very much understanding and balancing these communities. So that's there. Now, this is where travel comes in, right? So travel and tourism, the World Travel Tourism Council says that travel and tourism makes 1 in 10 jobs in the world. I would argue that's probably closer to 1 in 6. We recently did a study. My company did a whole algorithm and put together an algorithm that took a year to create that actually tracks job creation for every single booking or file that travels somewhere within countries in Africa and in Latin America and parts of Asia. And the numbers were staggering. Where we might see 6 or 7 people that are applied to that are involved in our travels, these numbers, the average number is 35, 36. So it's not just traveling to understand, it's traveling to seek perspective. It's traveling to be able to seek perspective and to be able to see and to understand better that perhaps the way we are seeing things is the way that we were taught to see things 40 years ago, 30 years ago, 20 years ago. And that way is changing. And being able to understand that is really key. And that's where travel comes in, is being part of it, right? And then the most important one, and we talked about this, listening before judging. When I went out onto those lines and talked to these people, I was just listening. I was just listening because I remember when I was a child in Kenya, remember we would have to stay home because there were riots that were happening because of election went a certain way, and mobs are going down the street and doing different things and whatnot. So it's so important. And those happen everywhere, unfortunately. We're not listening. We need to not judge, just listen. How somebody votes, whether they do a handwritten ballot, whether they check a piece of paper with a pencil and then put that pencil folded into a box, or whether they actually use a computer or a digital card or a Scantron, let's not judge. Let's not judge who they're electing. Oh, that president's been around for 40 years and they've been in power for 40 years. They should do this. They should do that. Who are we to lecture? Any of us. And that's why I wrote that article that said, that basically talked about the fact that we need to actually, and I did use developed nations, that article, on purpose, but we need to make sure we don't look down our nose at them, because we should be looking in the mirror. And if we look in the mirror, we will stop judging. And I think that's really, really, really important. Here's a closing thought. I want to read this to you. If we want to understand the world, we have to see it through more than just our own political lens. Thanks for joining us. Take care.
So we just walked through the community, the town of Kisoro. It's voting day, as I mentioned to you. Why did we do this? Why did Hillary and I go and walk through and talk to somebody in line, have Hillary share his thoughts? Because unfortunately, whenever there is elections anywhere in the continent of Africa, it seems for some reason that international media always paints it as a day of violence, which it's not. Have you seen anything here today? It's been peaceful, right?
Yeah, it's peaceful. Yeah.
So there's a constitution in place. The first one signed in 1962 67, and then 95. And the current constitution from 95 is the one that's in force today.
Yes, yes.
So not from 1700s, 1800s, 1500s, 1995. That's the constitution we're using. This is president number 4, I believe,
Yes,
that you're electing. And it's every 5 years that Uganda is choosing a president. And it was amazing because I think what we saw, people in line were all happy.
Yeah.
They were proud.
Yeah. They were very happy, yeah.
Yes, they were proud to vote.
Yeah.
And what the gentleman said when we were talking to him, it's not mandatory. You're right. You get to choose.
Yeah, you have to choose whoever you like.
Yeah, or you can choose not to vote, but you can choose to vote. Nobody's going to force you to vote.
Yes, please.
And we noticed that there were police here, not to disturb anything, but to make sure that there was order and calm. There's no instances of somebody saying you can't vote or where they're being driven away. Quite the opposite. There are means to go, and you have to go to your specific polling station, right?
Yes, yeah.
So you can't just vote somewhere else. Now this is important because this is a hot topic right now in the United States in terms of gerrymandering and whatnot. Here, there are specific polling stations where you have to go there. So if you're not at your polling station, you can't vote.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
Okay, so, Uganda has come a long way. And my wife's family, those of you who know, my wife's family is from Uganda. They left under, obviously, different circumstances. And now to see where Uganda has come, from where it was to what it is today, it's amazing.
Yeah, it's nice, yeah.
It's the pearl of Africa.
Yes, yeah. We call Uganda as the pearl of Africa. Reason, we have a good country of forests, mountains, valleys, rivers, lakes. So we do have everything. Good people. That is why you call Uganda as the pearl of Africa. So please join our country and enjoy the pearl of Africa and see how Uganda is a beautiful country.
So we're here with Macarius right now, standing in line to vote. Macarius, please tell everybody what voting day means to you and why this is such a... I see people that are happy in general and everything is going orderly, but you come every time. Please tell us about this.
With voting, it is just the government plan, of which recently, in a few early years, just getting a leader towards through battle fighting. So by the government implementation, we decided to be voting such that every person, every individual, every community person selects or votes for he or she knows can lead him or her genuine. So that's the purpose of voting.
So today in Uganda we are voting and we are choosing president, and whoever he or she wins will lead Uganda for more 5 years ahead. And voting is important because when having a good president, we'll be having a peaceful country. And every friend from any country, from USA, from outside of Uganda, will come in Uganda, enjoy he or she his holiday. So that is here why elections or voting, it's very important.
Thank you for listening to The Sustainable Voice. If you have a success story of your own, please reach out and share it with us. We'd love to hear from you. See you next time.